tend to be harder on the innovators, I guess is what I'm saying, even though, when I worked at my job, certainly that it was pushed so often at a certain point that you started to get jaded. It was just innovation for the sake of innovation. It like became the buzzword or the thing that was considered desirable. And sometimes I feel like I've had the success I've had in my career because actually what I do on a day-to-day basis is quite consistent.
Like,
and
if you were writing like flaming editorials, I would be like, Jane, is somebody like using your account? Or, whereas like, because it's like the tone and the temper is like such that like you're a reliable source rather than you're challenging every convention at every turn.
You do innovate, like, you like rebranded your whole site. You like obviously went into it very carefully, but I think, you're just not marketing yourself as an innovator. And I think that people who are marketing themselves as innovators, like honestly, Microcosm does, we're only able to do that and to successfully try new things because most of what we do is like being very strict about our best practices.
Like, should you be innovating? Is like question one.
Hi, I'm Joe Beal, the founder and CEO of Microcosm Publishing. I'm also the author of A People's Guide to Publishing, which distills what I've learned from selling millions of books over the past 28 years.
I'm Elly Blue, the vice president of Microcosm. We started this podcast to share what we've learned with newer publishers so you can learn from our mistakes. Or maybe you just want to learn about the publishing industry.
This week, we welcome back Jane Friedman, who is just about to, or I guess already has, rebranded the site of her news organ. Jane, would you like to talk about that and why?
Yeah, so my paid newsletter, once formerly known as The Hot Sheet, is now called The Bottom Line. The change is both branding as well as there's also a tech migration piece to it as well. So what I essentially did is that it's the 10-year anniversary of the newsletter this year. It started out as a partnership with someone else, but it's been my baby since 2019. But I still basically operated it as if it were a partnership with its own kind of separate branding, separate site, separate LLC, separate everything. And I decided that was actually hurting growth, and it not, like, a lot of people didn't even realize that Jane Friedman and the Hot Sheet were necessarily connected. So, and the biggest marketing tool I have is my own website at janefriedman.com. That's where people go when they have a publishing question. That's the one with all the site traffic. The paid newsletter site has never gotten any meaningful traffic. No one goes there unless they're a subscriber. So for strategic reasons, and also to coincide with the release of my book this spring, I decided to bring it all under one umbrella, the Jane Friedman umbrella, give it a new name, a name that I actually like rather than the old name. And now people, whether they're a subscriber or not, if they go to my site and search for something, they're going to see all of the free stuff. They're going to see all of the paid stuff. And if they want to become a subscriber and see the paid stuff, they can do it right there.
Well, this is a great segue.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is actually kind of a good
Fantastic.
segue into our reader
Would
question
you like
today.
to iterate a reader question, Elly, or would you like me to?
You should, because
that
you
is a
have it written down
very
in front of
true
you.
point. When our reader would like to know, should you follow what you know to be best practices for like how to publish, or maybe what the industry considers best practices, but maybe somewhat outdated? And when should you innovate, and how do you know the difference?
This is probably one of the most challenging questions we've covered. I mean, I generally feel like writers especially don't innovate often enough because they're too often looking off someone else's paper or doing it the way that has generally been described you should do it, rather than looking at their own business objectives or who their own audience is. So there was, but I had a really early career lesson in innovation when I worked in a traditional publishing house. And this was when I was under the Writer's Digest brand. And up until the point that I joined it, the brand only did 240-page black and white books at a certain price point that fed a book club. So there was a Writer's Digest book club. It was one of those punishing book clubs where you get sent the book every month unless you decline.
Like the BMG
Oh, yes.
club for yes, writing books.
Yes.
Mhm. Ooh.
Exactly.
I feel like the New Yorker also counts as that, by the way.
Mhm.
So the books were really made for that club and they had to fit that model. But this was like, then, Barnes and Noble came onto the scene and there was this huge kind of explosion of activity in chain bookstores and in people visiting those stores. So I'm talking about like the early 2000s. And so as I started working for this imprint, we started thinking about, surely we can do books that aren't for the book club, right? Like, people buy these books in the bookstore later as a trade paperback. Why can't we just do something that's not for the club? And so we did. And it was like this cute little 5x7 hardcover called Pocket Muse by Monica Wood, that had kind of a metallic, it was like a 1-color or a 2-color, I forget the exact term, but it was like this metallic ink was used as the accent. And it had a lot of pictures and it was basically a prompt book. It was a really fancy prompt book, and it sold 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 because there had been nothing else like it. And of course, as Writer's Digest, we knew that prompts were catnip, and we put it in this beautiful package, and it didn't matter that it wasn't in the book club because it sold through bookstores. So that's just it. But I mean, there was so much pushback from sales and marketing because they weren't accustomed to that sort of book, and they wanted to stay with what was safe and what they knew had always sold. And so I guess, and there wasn't necessarily any comparable book like that on the writing shelf, but certainly you could find them on other shelves. So you can see, well, it works for these other types of audiences. Why wouldn't it work for writers? So that maybe that story helps illustrate some of the things that will happen when you have an innovative idea, just kind of going outside your existing comfort zone.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I think like our industry could use to innovate more in a lot of ways, but like also like I'm highly aware of the dangers of like innovating too much. Like when I first started my own publishing company, I was like all innovation all the time, and the result was that I was constantly starting from scratch. I was always trying something new, and I was not like building on the momentum of what I'd already done or like learning the lessons from what I'd already done. I was just always on to the next thing. So I guess, yeah, where do you find that balance is my question as an over innovator.
Right. Well, to give like the flip side to that, fast forward 10 years and, because of that initial success, it got everyone excited. And so every book started becoming this bespoke project, which was not sustainable. Like you need some things that are very predictable and go by the book and help support the risk taking. And so eventually the poor production department, because they were having to spec out all of these unique things and they were getting exhausted. And eventually, especially as print production costs started to increase, they started to say, okay, look, you've got to use this trim size. No more of these 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch variations. You have to use this sort of paper. You can't have a belly band unless XYZ. So you can tell when you're starting, like you just want to do
I
something.
love that
different for
the belly
sake of doing
band
it
was
different.
set at your level rather than like at the production level or like or like at the like cost and scheduling or like profit and loss level. It's just, like, which is like a very publishing thing that like product development would like happen, and then you'd be like, oh, this is the impact of this choice. Oh, okay, got it. And I do feel like that would not happen in other industries. But so like I guess one thing that you kind of jogged my mind to was that we do different series, and like our classic series that was successful is called The Good Life, which is just like house and home and gardening books and that. And so we like try to do a few of those, and then 5-Minute Therapy got really popular for a reason I can't remember 9 years ago. And then that, so then we try to do like 2 of those per season. And then, we do like some other infill books where infill is the wrong term. Please forgive me, other authors but like books that you're like, we did a book that was like conflict resolution. We did a book that, like we do like other kind of relationship books. We do different things, and, like we will try new things sometimes. And it usually goes pretty well if we're either in like a genre that we read, or like where we would be the fans, so we wouldn't like screw it up because we do it wrong. And we really only do it wrong when we're trying to do something because we feel like it should be more popular or well received, but we don't actually properly understand it. Does that jog any thinking for you? Not to judge our approach, but more to think in terms of like what was successful and why, and like, again, when did innovation work out? When?
Yeah. I mean, another example from the same company, but this was a colleague of mine, that I think one of the weaknesses of the company was it wasn't particularly innovative. It did kind of try to just stick with what it knew and the markets that it had been in for many, many, many years. And so there was an editor who was very innovative and entrepreneurial, and she knew that in order to convince everyone else to do something else, she would have to show evidence of need, or she would have to do some research. And so the one thing that the company did that I've always respected is they would both do surveys. They had lots of ways of getting names for those surveys, and they would also run focus groups. And so this particular editor really wanted to do a line of how to draw manga and graphic novels and things of that nature. And this was a company that already understood how to do step-by-step books or how to teach kids drawing. That part they had covered, but they didn't know how to address this very different part of the market. I would say at the time it was a much more trendier, hipper, and this was not a hip company. So the editor just did tons of research to confirm her suspicions about how a book might work in that market, and then put together a focus group that actually changed her mind about what sort of book was going to do well. So that ended up being a really innovative line. For those who are curious, it was called the Impact line, and they did all sorts of books that were quite successful for many years. But I think I think you have to test some of your ideas before you go full in. And if you want, unless you have money to burn, right? And of course, if you're an editor at a company or an author trying to persuade a publisher, you have to do a little bit of a risk assessment or show some sort of business case for why you think this is a good bet to make.
Yeah, I think like that is a great point. And I also want to talk about the other side of it. Maybe you have some examples, possibly from the same company. But like, there's the kind of innovation where you're like, I have this new idea that I've generated, and I'm like putting that on top of what we already do. But then there's the aspect of this reader's question, I think, where you have to kind of look at what your existing best practices are, evaluate them, and maybe not do some of them, and see if you can find other ways to achieve the same goal.
Yes. Yeah.
Do you have thoughts? Ideas?
We're all just
But yeah,
contemplating
I like
that.
your idea of like low stakes risks. Like, if we have something where we are like topically unsure if there's a market or a reception, or we are the right publisher for either of those things, then we'll publish like the 32-page teaser and see if they bite, or if we sell 16 copies.
I think something that I see from, like I said, I find that innovation is less common than people just following the best practices or what they've been told are the best practices. But I find that the people who are always looking for that next idea, that next innovative idea, or like they're just built to always try and do something innovative. and this is probably speaking from a too personal experience of being approached by people with innovative ideas in the publishing industry. They think what they're doing is innovative, but they haven't actually looked around to see who is already doing something very much like that. I can't tell you how many times people have come up with the idea of like a hybrid publisher, and they think they are the first person to come up with that idea, or the idea of a marketplace where writers can post their manuscripts and agents will just browse through looking for something that they like. I'm like, look at cheaper, faster, better, like better in terms of quality, and you get to pick two. And so I often feel like you can try and look at which one of those are you going to innovate on and try to keep the other two or one, whatever, consistent. So like if you change all of the variables at once, I think that's where you start to get in, like for existing businesses, I think that's where you start to get into difficult territory where failure is more likely. So even though I did a rebrand and
it's like, right, start with like what's working well, and then fix like innovate on one of the three. Yeah.
Thanks for joining us once again.
Please send your questions to podcast@microcosmpublishing.com so we can answer them on future episodes.
And please give us 5 stars on iTunes and everywhere else that podcasts are reviewed.
You can find us on the internet at microcosm.pub,
On Twitter at microcosm,
on Facebook at Microcosm Publishing,
on Instagram at microcosm_pub.
and here in Portland, Oregon on North Williams Avenue.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful week.